Hello, everyone, and welcome to Execute, the Industry Academia Dialogue at the School of Law, Dhirubhai Ambani University. In this AI data protection and tech law segment of our podcast, today we have Ms. Shehnaz Ahmed. She is the lead of technology law at Vidhi. Vidhi is India's foremost policy think tanks. Now, welcome you, Shehnaz.
Core challenge that we face when we think about AI governance. I mean, especially when I think personal data is involved, because otherwise, I think regulatory framework around AI is sort of still evolving. Having said that, I do believe that when you look at the normative philosophy behind having concepts like whether it's consent, whether it is rights of data principles, I think there are compelling reasons to have it. It's just that I think when these concepts were initially designed, or rather the way these concepts are addressed in our existing laws, whether data protection or information technology, I think it sort of accounts for simpler data processing activities. It never had in mind, these opaque inference-driven systems, which are essentially what AI technologies do. So I think the problem is in terms of how these concepts get implemented. And I still believe that it is important to retain concepts like consent or a right to access or a right to erasure. But I think how it will work in the context of AI systems is something that we may need to re-engineer. So that's one point. On the second, I think another point where perhaps existing laws also need to evolve to account for, the ways in which AI systems are consuming or accessing data is around the fact of anonymization. So today, a lot of AI models, when they are training, they use anonymized data sets, meaning that the person identifiers are removed using certain techniques. And so that essentially they argue that it doesn't remain personal data, and accordingly, our concepts of consent or rights of data principles do not apply. Now, the problem with this sort of a framework in the context of existing laws is that today in India, at least, we don't have any regulatory clarity on anonymization. And I think that's very important because without sort of having any regulatory clarity, without recognizing or providing what kind of anonymization standards developers are supposed to use, we sort of give a free hand to everyone to adopt any kind of anonymization standards, which obviously is risky from a privacy standpoint. So I think this is one. Second part is that existing laws also need to wake up to the realities of how AI model training are happening and perhaps address these components. And last but not the least, in addition to perhaps understanding or re-engineering how traditional concepts are implemented, it will also be necessary for both lawyers as well as technologists to understand or come up with standards on important aspects, like let's say what auditability requirements of an AI model would look like, what kind of impact assessments are we thinking about, what kind of validation model testing can be done. Because unless we have clarity, I mean, we can always have a legal framework around that, but unless it is not possible to implement it in practice, I think there will always be this concern of having something on paper but not getting implemented. So I think to answer your question, these are the three things where I feel while the concepts of consent rights are very, very, very relevant, but I think the way in which it gets implemented will become more and more crucial for the purposes of AI governance.
Right, right. I completely agree with you that a lot of techno-legal solutions would be required here to actually implement these principles. And we cannot at the moment completely diverge also from the existing data privacy framework despite its shortcomings. Nevertheless, these traditional frameworks tend to put a lot of responsibility on the individual rather than the deployers or other parts of the AI system chain. So, how do think we should shift the responsibility more towards them, or how does this work now in the context of AI governance?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. The existing framework, and I think that's something which has often been critiqued is that because it is so consent heavy, and the way it's been implemented, it's essentially like buyer beware, or it's like a take it or a leave it approach. So the onus essentially falls on the buyer, which I don't think was the original idea. But having said that, I think in the context of AI systems, what I feel we will also have to consider is that the kind of data, if at all we go down the route of having personal data for training AI models, the problem there is that AI models need billions and millions of data sets. So it's impossible even for developers to come and perhaps comply with the consent requirements like the way we know it as of today, where individual consents are required for any processing activity. So I think we will also have to figure out perhaps how consent requirements will need to be worked out in the context of AI systems. And that's one thing that we will have to do. But I think at a broader level, where I feel the issue often comes is that it is, we always talk about AI governance or AI regulation, but I think it is also a question of perhaps how we as a country, or how we are thinking about regulation in the context of the interaction of users with machines, with technologies in a digital interface. Now, where today it is AI, tomorrow it's going to be some other emerging technology. So our regulations obviously cannot become technology specific. We have always followed the approach of being a technology, or of adopting technology neutral framework. So that is why I think we need to take a step back and perhaps think about what are the kind of perhaps rights users need to effectively perhaps sort of work around, or to effectively operate in a digital space in the context of consent also, or in the context of their interactions with AI systems. I think a fundamental right is a right to know that the fact that I'm interacting with an AI system, especially if that AI system is making a decision about my access to a certain service. So I think that is very important. The second part, which I think is important, is the fact that what do we want to regulate when we are talking about AI systems? Is it the technology? Is it the harm? Is it an output? Is it a behavior? I think unless we are able to answer this fundamental question, we will always struggle as to trying to figure out what is how our regulations should look like, or we'll end up retrofitting AI systems into existing frameworks, which may also not well. And of course, last but not the least is a question of, because in the context of AI systems, there are so many players. I mean, as you said, there are deployers, there are developers. So who will eventually become the point of regulation is also something that I feel will be important. So I think before a lot of things regarding AI regulation is something which we crystallize, I think it's important to take a step back and actually answer the fundamental questions, which is essentially what is it that we want to regulate in this space.
Right. I completely agree with you that we need to identify what the goal of regulation is and who is to be regulated, and particularly noting that it's eventually the basic rights we want to protect, whether it's the right to know, whether it's the right to privacy, or the right to choose. So, moving on from that, and I would like to ask you a very related question, that there are different approaches to regulating artificial intelligence. There is a very high-handed approach that European Union has adopted, and there's a very relaxed approach, on the other hand, from the United States. And then there are some middle paths, for example, Japan. So, which way do you think India should go, particularly because you see, we already have, one AI governance report by the subcommittee of MIT, and there are sectoral regulations coming up, like ICMR has come up with a sectoral guideline. So what way should India adopt, for balancing the advantages of AI along with mitigating the harms?
Yeah, I think we can definitely sort of learn from how EU has thought about AI regulation in terms of looking at it from a risk-based perspective. How US has perhaps sort of looked at it, which is mostly from it's a pro-innovation sort of an approach, and that's traditionally how both countries have looked at any response to their risk innovative technologies. But I think our response obviously has to be contextualized in and rooted in India's realities. We have to keep in mind that the user landscape that we have, as well as the ecosystem, the AI ecosystem in the country. Because on one hand, we also have, the government is focusing on an India AI mission where we are trying to sort of promote AI startups in the country. And there are, of course, a lot of strategic reasons, and perhaps rightly so, to promote these kind of innovations. So I think we will have to have a very, very balanced approach where perhaps we will not be able to go and make everything so prescriptive as perhaps EU has done, where the industry has matured and has reached a certain stage. Because here we are still trying to sort of figure out where how what kind of value propositions AI has, what kind of use cases it has, what kind of risks. Scalability is a question here, so I think it cannot perhaps be as prescriptive as that. But having said that, we also perhaps cannot become like, okay, let it leave, let everything go on its own, let it be on a self-regulatory mode. Reason being that, of the kind of users that we have, where perhaps some amount of regulation will be necessary. And I think to sort of, and that is where I think what I sort of mentioned earlier, a core framework which essentially sets out the very clearly the rights of any user while interacting in the digital space with any intermediary or any system or technology. I think that's important. A right to know, a right against automated decision making system is very important. Then, of course, you need to have ex ante measures for intermediaries who are developing certain kind of systems or technologies, especially from ensuring that what kind of due diligence and safety measures they have adopted. And last but not the least, also have a grievance redressal mechanism. And we know that, the grievance redressal mechanism under our Information Technology Act hasn't really worked well. So in the context of, let's say, AI risks and how do we also ensure that we have adjudicating mechanisms which can respond to it, as well as also the capability and the skill set to be able to sort of implement such a law. So I think we have to kind of have a core framework in our mind which sets out the baseline standards that perhaps is necessary for any interaction in the digital space, be it in the context of AI or any other technologies. And then that can be supplemented with sectoral regulations or sectoral guidelines, because also the uptake of AI is very different. So if you see today in the financial sector, you have RBI who's proactive, whose expert committee has now come up with a framework on how AI in financial sector should governance in financial sectors should look like. SEBI has been working around it. We have some guidelines in the healthcare sector, because these are sectors where we are seeing a lot of use cases. But having said that, perhaps there are other sectors where the use case hasn't really has really not really picked up that much. So I think it will depend on how we see sectoral adoption of AI is, and that is why I think leaving some sort of allowing sectoral regulators to come up with with some sort of a sectoral guidance would be also important. So I think to answer your question, in very simple words, I think a core framework is something which we need at a central level. And this must be supplement, which sort of serves as the baseline standards for any technology in India, or any interaction in the digital space. And this must be supplemented by sectoral guidelines.
Yes, I completely agree with you, and thank you very much, for clarifying this. That we definitely need, a core AI governance framework that applies throughout India, and then considering the specific risks in different sectors, the sectoral regulators can pitch in with their own specific regulations in that scenario. So, thank you. I think we had a very good conversation today, and I look forward to having similar conversations with you on data privacy or AI governance in the future, or any other emerging area of technology law. So, thank you very much, Shehnaz.
Thank you
It's
so
great.
much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much.